A warm welcome to all of you. Such a treat to be here practicing together. Morning, afternoon, or night, wherever you are in the world. Welcome. So my name is Dhammadipa, and this is the Sunday Sound of Dhamma program, and that means we'll do about 10 or 12 minutes of meditation together with a little light guidance, and then I will give a Dhamma reflection, Dhamma talk, for about half an hour or so, and then we'll have some time for comments or questions or anything you'd like to bring up. And if you're interested in Spanish interpretation, you're welcome to choose that on the menu. Para los que están buscando la interpretación en español, se consigue en el menú bajo interpretación. Hay un globo ahí y lo puedes elegir. Y eso también se está grabando. All right, beautiful. So this morning I thought that we could just begin with a meditation on mindfulness of the breath. Really going through step by step such that we can encourage the mind to be present for the whole length of the breath, including the pauses in between the breaths. So at this moment, you can go ahead and just settle into your meditation posture. Perhaps moving the body from side to side and front to back. So you're not leaning toward the computer screen. And allowing the body to find an upright, balanced posture. Releasing the belly and allowing the body to settle completely right here, right now. Slowly moving the attention up the body. And arriving at the face. And allowing the eyes to soften. And perhaps the mouth can also soften and relax. Now finding some place in the body where you can feel the sensations of the breath, breathing the body. Maybe it's in the upper lip or the nostrils, in the throat or in the chest. In the diaphragm, or even the echo of the breath in the lower abdomen. Just rest the mind wherever you feel the sensations of the breath. And checking in to see if you can find any pauses between the parts of the breath. Perhaps they're short or they're long. There's no need to change them at all. Just resting the mind and noticing those natural moments of stillness between the breaths. And having found those moments of stillness, you might also notice the start of each part of the breath. And the mind might be willing to ride along from the start all the way until the next pause. All right, that brings us to the end of the meditation for today. And I'm going to go ahead and move right into the Dhamma talk. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. A number of years ago, I was training as a chaplain. And so I was doing some formal training in a hospital outside of the San Francisco Bay Area there in California. And I had an encounter with a gentleman. And the part of the training of being a chaplain is to learn how to do exactly that, to have an encounter with someone, with anyone, actually, and wherever they are. And so this gentleman had come into the intensive care unit, and he took one look at me with the shaved head and the black jacket on, and he said, "Get out of here. I don't want to talk to you." Mm. And so I said, okay, all right, that's fine. People get to make that choice. That's part of what it means to interact with me, is that you get to make the choice not to talk. Claudia, creo que tienes el micrófono apagado y Amparo no puede escuchar. Ok. Ahora sí, Amparo. Todo bien. Okay. Excuse the distraction there for a moment. So in any event, then a couple days later, it was Ash Wednesday. And so all of us in the chaplaincy were to be going around the hospital and giving people the ashes, which was a big deal for me because I was sort of like, wow, me giving people ashes on Ash Wednesday? Like, what's that all about, you know? And so I kind of put it in the context of, you know, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, right? That kind of understanding of earth and death and some greater context for that. And so I said, okay, so we all went around the hospital during the day to our assigned areas, and then it was my turn to be on call that night, which I think that the supervisors did on purpose, you know. So it was my turn to be on call that night. And sure enough, you know, all the nursing staff had been told that if anybody didn't get their sacrament during the day, that they could let me know while I was on call that night. And sure enough, this gentleman hadn't gotten his. And so I was called to his room to offer him the sacrament. And so I came to the door kind of wondering how this is going to go. Maybe he will and maybe he won't, knowing that it's actually me. And it was dark. It was nighttime. It was dark in his room, and he was resting. He says somebody with a very extreme problem of back pain. That's why he was in the hospital, actually. And he said, "Oh yeah, come." I said, "I'm here. I'm here to give you the ashes because I heard that you didn't get them, and I'm the person that's on call tonight. So you can get them from me, or you can just decide you don't want them." And so he said, "No, please come in." And so we did. I gave him a little blessing, and then I stood back and I said to him, I said, "What do you think it means?" And I was talking more about like this particular moment, this particular ritual. But this gentleman took it like life. Like, what does it mean? What does it all mean? What does it mean that we're here doing this thing right here, right now? And it was a beautiful conversation. And we talked about the mystery of life, the mystery that brings us together in that moment, the mystery of what's wrong with him because nobody can understand it, the mystery of what is dukkha and what does it mean for him, for me? What does it mean for me to be of service to him in that way? The whole thing was it was a beautiful exploration of the mystery of life. And so I wanted to come today to talk to you a little bit about that, about the unfathomable, about the mystery. I think that it's very tempting to try to solve all our problems or answer all our questions. Even in Buddhism, sometimes we come with that approach, you know, that somebody should have all the answers to our questions. And what happens? You know, this is something that we can observe very closely. What happens within me when I encounter something that cannot be solved, that cannot be answered? It's a question you could ask yourself too, right? Do you get discouraged? Do you feel sad or depressed? Do you just disengage? You just turn away? Or maybe anger comes up, frustration, right? I think that much of the acting out of anger that we see in the world is related to that inability to be willing to accept the lack of an answer. The Dhamma teaches us that we must abide in the mystery of our lives. The Buddha himself described various things that could not be known, even to him, even to a Buddha. Later on, we want to think of him as being omniscient and knowing all things, but it's more appropriate to say that he understood how the principles of all things were working. But nonetheless, he said that we needed to abide in the mystery of things, that there were some unknowable things. And since it's Women's History Month, then I thought that I would bring some teaching from some Buddhist women forth for you. So, speaking of the mystery and the limits of knowing, and how the Dhamma teaches us to attend to that. So I want to talk a little bit about the Chula Vedala Sutta. So the Chula Vedala Sutta is that means the shorter discourse elaborating or describing. And it's one of the very few teachings that we have in the Pali texts that is from one of the Terries, one of the awakened women of the Buddhist time, as a teaching by Dhammadipa Terry. Dhammadipa. And Terry means elder. And the Theravada is the way of the elders, the Teras. That's a male form of the word, and Terry is a female form of the word. And Vada means the way. So this school is the way of the elders, meaning those who had become the seniors by virtue of their awakening, not by virtue of their age, but by virtue of their wisdom. So she was one of those, Dhammadipa. She was actually named, the Buddha named her the foremost bhikkhuni in teaching Dhamma, in sharing Dhamma. So she's a name that you should know, Dhammadipa. Dhammadipa. And this sutta, let's see, I forgot to tell you the number, just in case some of you want to look it up, middle length discourse number 44. So it's middle length, and that means we're not going to go through the whole thing. I'm just going to speak a little bit about the end of the sutta, actually. But the sutta is a conversation between her and her ex-husband, Visakha. And I laugh because Visakha comes and basically poses like the 20 questions of her and just goes on, question after question after question, basically testing her in a certain way. And she, equanimous, just answers question after question after question. There's more than 20 questions actually in here. So that's why I said we're not going to go through all of them. But she responds to all of his questions. But finally they get to this part near the end. So now he's asked questions about the phenomenal world and a little bit about the five aggregates, the body and mind, the relationship to the world and the mind, and so on. And excuse me. So they get to this part where, and I touched on this, I think, a couple of weeks ago, where there is this discussion of the underlying tendencies. And Fumio was when you reminded me that I had used that phrase, underlying tendencies, the anusaya. And the underlying tendencies are that one has a tendency, typically, of greed toward pleasant phenomena, pleasant kinds of contact, pleasant kinds of experience, and a tendency toward aversion or pushing away or repulsion toward unpleasant phenomena, and a tendency to ignore or to turn away from neutral phenomena. It's just not interesting enough, or it doesn't stimulate our sense of self enough to pay attention to. And so she talks about giving up those tendencies toward those things and actually learning how to attend to each one of them without greed, without hatred or aversion, without turning away. And he says, should they always be given up? And she says, no, not in all instances. Those tendencies should not always be given up. So one thing that I want to say is sometimes the Dhamma can also be presented in these very black and white kind of ways. Right? That all painful feeling is something that we are trying to avoid, or all pleasant feeling is something that we are trying to avoid, or there's all these different ways that you hear the Dhamma painted in very dualistic ways, but actually that's not true, even of the very early teachings, I think, if we really understand them well. So she says, no, not in all instances. And then she goes on to talk about that. When are the times that we can, for example, lean into our tendency for liking positive experience in the meditation, for example, when joy comes up in the meditation, then that tendency of a little bit more might not be so bad. You could enjoy some more of that. Yeah. And so on. But then we get to this last part. Okay, so now I'm gonna get to the part that ties into my first part of my talk. So he goes into these kinds of dualities again. And he says, what is the counterpart, or you could say the other side of the coin of pleasant feeling? And she says, painful feeling. That's the other side. And he says, well, what's the counterpart of painful feeling? And she says, well, pleasant feeling is the counterpart. That's the other side of that. And he says, okay, well, then what about neutral? What's the other side of the neutral feeling? And she says, ignorance, right? That tendency of just confusion, of not knowing what the thing is at all, because it's so neutral that we can't really pay attention to it, or we can't really discern it, or we don't care enough to bother to try to be present with it. And then he says, okay, so what's the counterpart of ignorance? Well, the counterpart of ignorance is knowledge, is knowing. The other side of ignorance is actually knowing and understanding. And the counterpart of knowing and understanding is, this is a good one, which we see literally thousands of times in the suttas, is freedom. Freedom as the counterpart of knowing. The freedom to choose how you will respond to a thing. And what's the counterpart of freedom? Nibbana. The other side of freedom is Nibbana. And he says, well, what's the other side of Nibbana? And then she says, oh, now you've gone too far, guy. She says, literally, your question goes too far, Visakha. You didn't figure out the limit of questioning. So there is a limit of questioning. Yeah? Could we talk about what nibbana means, or what is the relationship of freedom and nibbana? Of course we could. But there's also some way that we need to accept that some things are unfathomable. Some things will completely resist being put in a box. So the sutta ends by her saying, you go check it out with the Buddha in case you're not sure about my answers. So he does. He goes to the Buddha, and he, according to the sutta, recounts the whole thing and says, this is what Dhammadina told me. And the Buddha says, if you came to me and asked these questions, I would have answered exactly the same way as the nun Dhammadina. That's what it means, and that's how you should remember it. And then the killer line, the worst line of the whole sutta is, satisfied, the layman Visakha was happy with what the Buddha said, not what Dhammadina said. Right? So, nonetheless, she's remembered as one of the greats. Yeah. And she teaches us a very important lesson, that there is knowing and there is not knowing. And the Dhamma is about both of those two things. There is a limit to the question. So we see this teaching also much later. We see this teaching over and over again through many, many different Buddhist traditions. This teaching of the unfathomable. My first ordination teacher, Seke Harada Roshi, wrote a whole book called Unfathomable Depths about some Chinese Chan poetry. And I don't have the book with me, so I'm not going to go there. But I do want to turn a little bit to the Chinese Chan tradition, because they had a wonderful way of talking about the mystery and the unfathomable. And so I'm reading a little quote from a book by Zenke Blanche Hartman. So Zenke Roshi, she was a Dharma transmitted teacher. She was an American woman from the South. She was the first abbot of San Francisco Zen Center, the first woman abbot of San Francisco Zen Center. There had been many men before her, including Suzuki Roshi, who had been her teacher. But Blanche, she just went around as Blanche. And Blanche is kind of my Dharma grandmother at the time, the years that I lived in Zen Center. And she wrote this book called Seeds for a Boundless Life. Seeds for a Boundless Life. She knew about boundlessness and mystery. So she, in this book, she tells one of the stories from the Denkoroku. Denkoroku, there's a slight typo here in the book. The Denkoroku is this transmission of light. The book, that title means the record of transmitting the light. It was by Keizan Zenji, one of the co-founders of the Soto Zen tradition, Japanese Soto Zen tradition. And it's a series of stories of awakening moments. It's also a very, very interesting book that I gave a class on a number of years ago. And one of the awakening moments, or one of the conversations, is basically about conversations around awakening moments, or prior to awakening moments, or at awakening moments. So one of the conversations is this, is Dao Ying. So this is Les Hickson's translation. enters the Dharma hall and remarks to the practitioners, "If you wish to attain a limitless result, you must become a limitless being. And since you are already such a being, why be anxious about bringing about such a result?" And Blanche asked the question, then once we realize that we are a limitless being, will we still keep practicing? Well, yes. Well, of course, she answers her own question. Well, of course. Right. Because the idea is not to create more limits or to pile up the ultimate pile of knowledge. It is to be fully in harmony with this expression, to know that harmony that is already here. It is to open yourself to the willingness to be unfathomable, to not box yourself into something else, something smaller, something more well-defined. So I want to close with one more little quote from Blanche. Dear Blanche, I miss her a lot. She died a number of years ago now, probably 7 years ago or so now. She says, "I don't ask you to look for the words for it." You can decide what it means. Enlightenment, life, practice, Buddhism. I don't ask you to look for the words for it. Words are secondary. I want you to find the feel of it. I want you to find the fire of it. So that is the kind of practice that I would encourage you to think about. Instead of looking to the texts and the people in your life and your own mind for the answer that you think will make it all okay. It must be bigger than that. Your life, the Dhamma, it must be bigger than that. So thank you for your attention today. That's what I wanted to share. Happy beginning of Women's History Month. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.